Take a slow, deep breath. Let the weight of the day slip away from your shoulders. Let your mind soften and settle. Tonight, we're going on a journey together, but not through space, through time. An impossibly long journey stretching back through the millennia, through the mists of deep history, to a time when the world was younger, colder, and infinitely wilder than anything we know today. Close your eyes and imagine stepping backward through time. Years peel away like pages in an ancient book. Centuries blur into millennia. We move past the birth of civilization, past the first farms and cities, past the invention of writing and the wheel. We drift further still into an age before recorded history, before monuments or agriculture, before pottery or permanent homes. We're traveling to a time when humans lived as nomads, following the herds, reading the seasons and the stars, surviving by wit and cooperation alone. The landscape around us transforms. The familiar contours of the modern world fade and reshape themselves. Glaciers tower where cities once stood. Vast grasslands called steppes roll endlessly beneath an enormous sky. The air grows colder, sharper, filled with the scent of earth and ice and wild things. We've arrived somewhere between 30,000 and 40,000 years before the present day, deep in the heart of the last great ice age, in a time that would seem utterly alien to our modern eyes, yet intimately familiar in ways we might not immediately recognize. In this frozen world, in this landscape of ice and stone and endless wind, something extraordinary is about to happen. Something that will change the course of human history more profoundly than almost any other event in our long story on this planet. Two species, two apex predators who should have been eternal enemies, are about to forge a partnership that will endure for thousands upon thousands of years, surviving ice ages and migrations, civilizations and catastrophes, binding their fates together in ways that neither could have possibly imagined. This is the story of how wolves became dogs. But more than that, it's the story of how humans and another species learned to trust each other, to communicate across the barriers that separated them, to build something entirely new in the history of life on Earth. It's a story written in bones and genes, in ancient burial sites and genetic markers, in the archaeological record and in the very structure of our brains. It's a story that continues tonight in homes all around the world, wherever a dog curls up beside its human companion, maintaining a bond that stretches back through the deep corridors of time to those first tentative encounters on the windswept plains of the Ice Age. So settle in. Let your breathing deepen. Feel the comfort of wherever you're resting tonight. And let us travel together to that ancient world, to witness the beginning of the world's most enduring friendship, the partnership that shaped both species and created something beautiful from the harsh necessities of survival in an unforgiving age. To understand how wolves became dogs, we must first understand the world in which this transformation began. Imagine, if you will, a planet gripped by ice. Not just in the far polar regions, but stretching down across much of the northern hemisphere, glaciers thick enough to bury mountains, sheets of ice miles deep advancing and retreating with the rhythm of climate cycles we can barely comprehend today. Between approximately 125,000 and 11,700 years ago, the Earth experienced what we call the Pleistocene epoch, better known to us as the Ice Age. But within this long frozen era, there were periods of even more intense cold, and it was during one of these especially frigidal intervals, somewhere around 30,000 to 40,000 years before the present, that our story truly begins. Picture the landscape of what we now call Europe and Northern Asia. Where modern cities sprawl, there existed instead an environment called the Mammoth Steppe, a cold grassland ecosystem unlike anything found on Earth today. This was not the dense forest you might imagine covering ancient Europe, nor was it simply tundra. Instead, it was a unique biome, a cold, dry grassland that supported an astonishing abundance and diversity of large grazing animals. The vegetation was hardy, adapted to survive long, bitter winters and relatively brief summers. Grasses, sedges, and forbs created a tough but nutritious carpet of plant life that could sustain massive herbivores year-round. And what herbivores they were! This was a world of giants, creatures that would seem like something from mythology if we encountered them today. Woolly mammoths, their curved tusks reaching toward the sky, their thick coats of reddish-brown hair protecting them from winds that could freeze flesh in minutes, moved in herds across the open landscape. These weren't just large elephants with fur. They were magnificently adapted Ice Age specialists, with small ears to prevent heat loss, a hump of fat on their shoulders to provide energy reserves through the long winter, and those remarkable tusks that could sweep aside snow to reach the vegetation beneath. Alongside the mammoths walked woolly rhinoceros, another thick-furred giant carrying two horns on its massive skull. These solitary or small group dwellers had adapted to the cold just as remarkably as the mammoths, developing dense underfur covered by long guard hairs that kept them warm even in the most extreme conditions. They were browsers and grazers, using their horn to sweep aside snow much as the mammoths used their tusks. There were horses, but not the domestic horses we know today. These were stocky, powerfully built creatures, more similar to modern Powalski's horses, with thick necks, large heads, and the endurance to survive on sparse winter forage. They traveled in herds that could number in the hundreds or thousands, their hoofbeats thundering across the frozen ground when alarmed, creating clouds of snow dust that hung in the frigid air. Steppe bison roamed these lands as well, significantly larger than their modern descendants, with enormous horn cores that could span over a meter. These were not the American bison we know from more recent history, but their Ice Age cousins, adapted to the cold grasslands of Europe and Asia. They lived in herds, their numbers rising and falling with the seasons and the availability of grazing. Giant ground sloths, despite their names suggesting slow movement, were actually quite capable creatures, some species reaching heights that would allow them to browse from trees, though in the steppe environment they would have focused on ground-level vegetation. There were giant deer, known as Irish elk despite being neither exclusively Irish nor actually elk, sporting antlers that could span nearly 4 meters from tip to tip, the largest antlers of any known deer species, living or extinct. Musk oxen, with their long shaggy coats and curved horns, formed defensive circles when threatened, the young protected in the center, the adults facing outward in an impenetrable wall of horns and massive heads. Reindeer and caribou migrated in vast herds, moving with the seasons, following ancient paths that had been established over countless generations. Even camels existed in this landscape, not the desert-dwelling species we know today, but cold-adapted versions that ranged across the northern reaches of the ancient world. This was the prey base, the great herbivorous multitude that converted plant matter into flesh, creating an energy-rich food source for the carnivores that hunted them. And what carnivores they were. This was a predator's paradise, if survival in such harsh conditions could ever be called paradise. A time when multiple large carnivore species coexisted, each carving out its own ecological niche, each finding its own way to survive and thrive in this frozen world. Cave lions prowled this landscape, enormous cats that stood taller at the shoulder than modern lions, with powerful builds and hunting strategies that allowed them to take down prey as large as young mammoths. Saber-toothed cats, though different species depending on the exact time and place, wielded their remarkable canine teeth as specialized tools for hunting thick-skinned megafauna. The giant short-faced bear, particularly in parts of North America, stood taller than any bear species alive today, a formidable predator or scavenger with long legs built for covering ground and a massive skull equipped for crushing bones. Dire wolves, particularly in the Americas, hunted in packs much like their modern counterparts but with heavier builds and more powerful jaws, adaptations that allowed them to take down and consume large prey efficiently. These were not the wolves that would become dogs, but related species, competing for many of the same resources, living in the same challenging environments, facing similar pressures and opportunities. And then there were the gray wolves themselves, Canis lupus, the ancestors of all modern dogs. In the Ice Age, these wolves were magnificent creatures, often larger and more robust than most modern gray wolves, adapted to the cold with thick winter coats, powerful bodies built for both endurance and explosive speed, and highly developed social behaviors that made pack hunting devastatingly effective. These were not the simplified cartoon villains of fairy tales, but complex, intelligent animals with rich social lives, sophisticated communication systems, and remarkable adaptability that allowed them to survive in diverse habitats from frozen tundra to temperate forests. Genetic analysis has given us remarkable insights into these Ice Age wolves. Studies of ancient wolf genomes spanning the last 100,000 years have revealed that wolf populations during the late Pleistocene were far more interconnected than modern wolf populations. Ancient wolves from regions as far apart as Alaska and Europe continued to share recent ancestry, suggesting that despite the vast distances and challenging terrain, wolves were highly mobile creatures whose populations remained in genetic contact across enormous ranges. This population connectivity allowed evolutionary changes to sweep through wolf populations across continents. For instance, A gene involved in craniofacial development went from being incredibly rare to present in 100% of wolves within just 10,000 years, beginning around 40,000 years ago. Another cluster of genes related to olfaction experienced a similar rapid spread between 45,000 and 25,000 years ago, suggesting that wolves were evolving adaptations like stronger jaws and more sensitive noses that helped them survive the harsh conditions of the Ice Age. The climate itself was a major character in this story. The last glacial period, spanning from about 125,000 to 14,500 years before present, saw dramatic fluctuations in global temperature. The last glacial maximum, occurring roughly 28,000 to 23,000 years ago, represented the peak of the most recent ice age, when ice sheets reached their maximum extent. Northern Europe, much of Britain, all of Scandinavia, and large portions of North America lay buried beneath glaciers, in some places several kilometers thick. These weren't just caps of ice on mountain peaks, but continent-spanning sheets that fundamentally altered global climate patterns, sea levels, and the distribution of life on Earth. The climate was not just cold, it was dry. With so much water locked up in glacial ice, sea levels dropped dramatically, exposing land bridges and creating vast continental shelves. The air held less moisture and precipitation patterns shifted dramatically. The regions not covered by ice experienced conditions quite different from today. The Mammoth Steppe existed in part because of this cold, dry climate, an environment that wouldn't support either dense forest or true tundra, but instead created its own unique ecosystem. Temperature fluctuations could be extreme even within relatively short time periods. Climate records preserved in ice cores from Greenland and Antarctica reveal that temperatures could shift by several degrees within just decades, creating periods of rapid environmental change that challenged the survival of every species attempting to make a living in these lands. Plants had to be hardy enough to survive not just the cold but also the unpredictability, the sudden shifts between slightly less frigid and brutally frozen periods. For the animals living in this environment, survival required remarkable adaptations. Physical adaptations were crucial. Thick fur, large bodies to conserve heat, specialized digestive systems to extract maximum nutrition from sometimes sparse forage. But behavioral adaptations were equally important. Migration patterns had to be flexible enough to respond to shifting resource availability. Social structures needed to provide protection and improve hunting or foraging efficiency. Communication systems had to be sophisticated enough to coordinate group activities and maintain social bonds across the challenges of daily survival. Into this world, humans had recently arrived, though recent is a relative term in deep time. Anatomically, modern humans had been spreading out of Africa for tens of thousands of years, moving in waves across Asia and into Europe, encountering and in some cases interbreeding with other hominid species like Neanderthals and Denisovans, but ultimately establishing themselves across vast territories. By the time period we're focused on, humans had developed sophisticated tool-making traditions, controlled fire, created elaborate shelters, fashioned clothing from animal hides, and developed social structures complex enough to share knowledge across generations and coordinate complex tasks like large game hunting. These humans were us, not in terms of culture or technology, but biologically. They had the same brains we have, the same capacity for language, planning, abstract thought, and creativity. If you could somehow bring a baby from that time to the present day and raise it in a modern family, it would be indistinguishable from any other child, capable of learning to read and write, to use computers, to create art or music or solve mathematical problems. The differences between them and us are cultural and technological, not biological. They were fully human with all the intelligence, emotion, and complexity that implies. But their lives were utterly different from ours in ways that can be difficult for us to truly comprehend. There were no permanent settlements, no agriculture, no domesticated animals except perhaps, right at the very edge of our time period, the first proto-dogs emerging from wolf populations. Everything they needed to survive had to be hunted, gathered, or created from raw materials found in their environment. Every meal represented success in the constant challenge of finding food. Every warm night meant successful shelter construction and maintenance of fire. Every winter survived was a victory against odds that could shift without warning as weather patterns changed or game animals migrated unpredictably. The archaeological record from this period is sparse but telling. We find sophisticated stone tools, showing that these people were master craftspeople who understood the properties of different types of stone and could shape them with remarkable precision into knives, scrapers, spear points, and countless other implements. We find evidence of needles made from bone, suggesting they sewed tailored clothing, crucial for survival in extreme cold. We find the remnants of substantial structures built from mammoth bones and hides, showing they could create shelter even where wood was scarce. We find art, beautiful paintings on cave walls, and remarkable small sculptures, demonstrating that even in the midst of constant survival challenges, humans had the time and inclination to create beauty, to represent the world around them, to express something that transcended mere survival. These were sophisticated people living in an unforgiving world, and into their camps and hunting grounds, drawn by the smell of cooking meat and the warmth of fires, came the wolves. The stage was set for one of the most important partnerships in human history, a relationship that would transform both species and echo through the millennia to the present day. In the natural world, apex predators typically don't become friends. They compete, they avoid each other, they establish territories and defend them vigorously against intrusion. Two species hunting the same prey, requiring similar habitats, possessing comparable intelligence and social sophistication, should by all ecological logic have been sworn enemies, locked in endless competition for limited resources. Yet somehow, against all reasonable expectations, humans and wolves found a way not just to coexist but to cooperate, to form bonds that would eventually transform one species entirely and alter the trajectory of the other in profound ways. The initial encounters between Paleolithic humans and Ice Age wolves must have been fraught with tension and danger. Both were pack hunters, though organized quite differently. Both targeted large game animals that were difficult and dangerous to kill, requiring coordination, communication, and courage. Both were intelligent enough to assess threats and opportunities, to remember encounters and adjust behavior accordingly. Both were protective of their young, territorial about their hunting grounds, and capable of considerable aggression when threatened or challenged. From the wolf's perspective, humans would have been strange and potentially dangerous creatures. We moved differently than any other animal, walking upright on two legs, using our hands to carry and manipulate objects. We controlled fire, something no other animal could do, creating light and warmth that altered the environment in ways that must have seemed almost magical. We created sounds unlike any natural animal call, speaking in complex patterns that clearly conveyed meaning to other humans even if wolves couldn't initially understand that meaning. We used tools, extending our reach and our lethality far beyond our physical capabilities alone. A human with a spear was a very different proposition than a human without one. We also behaved in ways that would have seemed unusual from a wolf's perspective. We didn't always immediately consume our kills, instead processing them, sometimes carrying meat back to camps rather than feeding at the kill site. We moved across the landscape following patterns that weren't immediately obvious, sometimes staying in one area for extended periods, other times packing up and traveling considerable distances. We modified our environment in small but noticeable ways, creating clearings, building structures, leaving traces of our passage that would have been evident to any animal with a good sense of smell and sharp observational skills. From the human perspective, wolves were formidable and dangerous predators. An adult gray wolf of the Ice Age could weigh anywhere from 30 to 80 kilograms or more, with powerful jaws capable of exerting tremendous bite force, sharp teeth designed for tearing meat and crushing bone, and a body built for both endurance and surprising bursts of speed. Wolves hunted in packs, showing sophisticated coordination that allowed them to bring down animals many times their individual size. They were territorial, defending their hunting grounds against intruders, including other wolf packs and potentially humans who ventured into areas the wolves considered their own. Moreover, wolves were intelligent and adaptable. They could learn from experience, adjusting their behavior based on past successes and failures. They could communicate complex information to pack members through a sophisticated combination of vocalizations, body language, and scent marking. They showed what we would recognize as emotions, forming strong bonds within their packs, showing what appeared to be grief when pack members died, displaying clear signs of play and joy in appropriate contexts. The archaeological record preserves hints of these early interactions, though interpreting them requires careful analysis and considerable expertise. Cut marks on ancient wolf bones from some archaeological sites suggest that humans were hunting and butchering wolves, possibly for their pelts, which would have provided warm, durable fur for clothing, or perhaps to eliminate competition for prey animals. At other sites, wolf remains are found in what appear to be more ritualistic contexts. carefully buried or placed in ways that suggest they held some special significance. One particularly fascinating piece of evidence comes from a Paleolithic site where wolf remains were found with clear evidence of injury that had healed during the animal's lifetime. The healing of such injuries would have required time and likely some degree of reduced activity, raising the question of how a wild wolf with compromised mobility could have survived. Did it receive help from its pack? Was it perhaps already living in proximity to humans who inadvertently or deliberately provided food? Such questions are tantalizing but difficult to answer definitively from the archaeological record alone. The genetic evidence adds another layer to our understanding. When scientists compared ancient wolf genomes with those of early dogs and modern wolves, they discovered something remarkable. Dogs are more closely related to ancient wolves from eastern Eurasia than to wolves from western Eurasia, suggesting that the domestication process likely began somewhere in the eastern reaches of the Eurasian landmass. However, none of the ancient wolf genomes examined so far is a direct match for the ancestral wolf population that gave rise to dogs, meaning that the exact location and identity of the founding population remains elusive, hidden somewhere in the past waiting to be discovered. What's particularly interesting is that after the split between wolves and dogs, gene flow appears to have been primarily one way, from dogs back into wolf populations rather than the reverse. This is contrary to what we see in most other domesticated species, where wild populations regularly contribute genes to domestic populations. The pattern suggests that once the dog lineage began to diverge, it remained relatively isolated genetically from contemporary wolf populations, perhaps because the behavioral and physical differences that developed made successful interbreeding less likely, or because emerging dogs were living in such close association with humans that opportunities for mating with wild wolves were limited. The question of why wolves and humans didn't simply remain enemies is central to understanding the domestication process. Every ecological principle suggests they should have competed fiercely. Both hunted the same large herbivores. Both required substantial territories to support a sustainable population. Both were intelligent enough to recognize the other as a threat and capable enough to pose real danger. In most ecological scenarios, we would expect these two species to avoid each other as much as possible, or to actively attempt to reduce the other's population through direct conflict. Several factors may have created openings for a different kind of relationship to develop. First, humans and wolves actually hunted somewhat differently and may have targeted different types of prey or different individual animals within a prey population. Human hunters with spears and other weapons could be selective, targeting specific animals and using tactics that didn't require the extended chase often employed by wolves. Wolves, on the other hand, were built for endurance predation, running down prey over long distances, using their numbers and coordination to exhaust and eventually bring down animals that might flee from human hunters. This difference meant that in some situations humans and wolves might not have been direct competitors but rather specialists taking advantage of different aspects of the same resource base. Humans might take larger, healthier adult animals using ambush tactics or drive hunts where available terrain made such strategies feasible. Wolves might more often take younger, older, or weaker animals through pursuit predation. While there would certainly be overlap, the differences were potentially significant enough to reduce direct competition. Second, both species created opportunities that the other could exploit. When wolves made a kill, they typically consumed what they needed and then either defended the carcass for later feeding or abandoned it if disturbed or sated. Humans, with their tool use and fire, could make use of a carcass in ways wolves couldn't, processing hides, breaking bones to extract marrow, and using fire to cook and preserve meat. If humans discovered a recent wolf kill, they might be able to claim it, particularly if the wolves had already fed and were less motivated to defend the carcass aggressively. Similarly, when humans made a kill, they might leave behind portions that wolves could scavenge. While humans certainly used as much of a kill as possible, processing a large animal like a mammoth or bison was time-consuming work, and there would inevitably be scraps, bones with some meat remaining, or internal organs that might be less desirable to human taste. For wolves, any protein was valuable, and the leavings from a human kill could represent an easy meal that didn't require the risk and energy expenditure of hunting. Third, both species might have derived benefits from the presence of the other in ways that weren't immediately obvious. Wolves howling or becoming agitated might alert humans to the presence of other predators or potential prey animals. The smoke from human fires and the activity around human camps might actually deter some predators, creating a safer zone that wolves could potentially exploit. These indirect benefits wouldn't immediately lead to cooperation, but they might make toleration more likely than constant antagonism. The turning point, the shift from toleration at a distance to something closer to association, probably happened gradually over many wolf and human generations, through processes that involve both species changing in response to the other's presence. We call this coevolution, the mutual adaptation of interacting species, and it's a powerful force in biological systems. For wolves, the presence of humans represented both a threat and an opportunity. The wolves that were too aggressive, that constantly challenged humans or threatened human camps, would likely have been killed. Early humans had effective weapons and the intelligence to use them defensively. An overly aggressive wolf or wolf pack that repeatedly approached human camps or attacked human hunters would have been viewed as an unacceptable threat and eliminated. This created a selection pressure against extreme aggression toward humans. At the same time, wolves that were too fearful would miss out on potential opportunities. Scavenging from human kills or around human camps required some degree of tolerance for human presence. The wolves that could approach close enough to benefit from these resources without triggering aggressive responses from humans would have had a caloric advantage, particularly during harsh winters or periods when hunting was difficult. This created what evolutionary biologists call a selection gradient, a situation where intermediate behaviors are favored. The most aggressive wolves and the most fearful wolves both did worse than wolves with an intermediate temperament. Those that could assess human behavior, approach cautiously when opportunities arose, but retreat when humans showed signs of hostility. Over many generations, this steady selection pressure would have shifted the population toward this intermediate temperament. For humans, the equation was somewhat different but also involved complex calculations of costs and benefits. Wolves that stayed away were simply part of the landscape, neither particularly beneficial nor particularly threatening. Wolves that were too aggressive had to be dealt with, which required time, risk, and expenditure of resources like weapons that might be damaged or lost in confrontations. But wolves that were tolerant, that could be near without causing problems, might offer some advantages. A wolf or wolves hanging around the edges of a camp might alert humans to approaching danger, as wolves would likely notice and respond to threats like other predators or other human groups. Wolves were also incredibly efficient at processing carcasses, consuming parts that humans might not want and cleaning up scraps that could otherwise attract less welcome scavengers. In a world without modern sanitation, having something that disposed of waste could be genuinely beneficial. Moreover, humans are social creatures with a remarkable capacity to form attachments to other species. Anyone who has spent time around animals knows how easily we can develop feelings of affection or protectiveness toward them, even species quite different from ourselves. Archaeological evidence suggests that even Paleolithic humans sometimes kept and cared for animals, not necessarily for practical purposes but perhaps simply because they wanted to. If a human hunter came across orphan wolf pups, the impulse to care for them rather than kill them wouldn't be strange or unnatural. Raising such pups would create animals that were comfortable around humans, had been exposed to human sounds and smells and behaviors from an early age, and might as adults show different behaviors than wild wolves. This process, if it happened repeatedly across different human groups and different wolf populations, could create subpopulations of wolves that were increasingly adapted to living around humans. These wolves would differ from fully wild wolves not through deliberate selective breeding by humans trying to create a new kind of animal, but through natural selection operating in the unique ecological niche created by human presence. We call this the proto-domestication hypothesis, or sometimes the commensal scavenger hypothesis, and it suggests that the first steps toward domestication happened not through human intention but through wolves essentially domesticating themselves by adapting to exploit resources available around human settlements. This hypothesis has gained considerable support from recent research, though debates continue about exact mechanisms and timelines. What seems increasingly clear is that the transformation of wolves into dogs was a complex, gradual process that likely varied in details from place to place and time to time, that involved changes in both species, and that created something genuinely new in the natural world. A partnership between two species that crossed the boundaries of competition to find mutual benefit and cooperation. One of the most elegant and surprising pieces of the dog domestication puzzle emerged from research into a seemingly simple question. What did Ice Age humans eat during the long, brutal winters when plant foods became scarce or unavailable? The answer to this question revealed a remarkable paradox that may have been crucial in transforming the relationship between humans and wolves from competition to cooperation. To understand this paradox, we need to delve into the nutritional biochemistry of humans and the specific challenges of living in extreme cold environments. Humans are omnivores, evolved from ancestors that were primarily herbivorous or insectivorous primates. While we have adapted to consume a wide range of foods including substantial amounts of meat, we retain some limitations that more specialized carnivores don't have. One of the most important of these limitations is our ability to process protein. Protein is made up of amino acids, and when we consume protein, our bodies break it down into these constituent parts and reassemble them into the specific proteins we need for building and maintaining tissues, creating enzymes and hormones and countless other biological functions. However, the process of metabolizing protein generates nitrogen-containing waste products that must be filtered out by the kidneys and excreted in urine. There's a limit to how much protein the human kidney can safely process without causing problems. When humans consume too much protein relative to other nutrients, particularly relative to fat and carbohydrates, they can develop what's called protein poisoning or rabbit starvation, named because it was commonly observed in trappers and explorers who tried to survive by eating only lean rabbit meat without sufficient fat. The symptoms include nausea, diarrhea, fatigue, and eventually more serious metabolic problems. The limit isn't a hard number that applies to everyone, but generally humans can safely derive no more than about 35 to 50% of their caloric intake from protein without experiencing negative effects. This limitation wouldn't have been a significant problem for most of human history in most environments. Plant foods provide carbohydrates. Many animals, particularly when they're healthy and well-fed, carry substantial fat deposits. A varied diet naturally provides the balance of nutrients humans need. But in the Ice Age environment of northern Eurasia during the coldest periods, the situation was quite different. Researchers studying this question looked carefully at the climate data for regions where early dog remains have been found, along with evidence of human Ice Age activity. They reconstructed what the prey species in these areas would have been like during different seasons, paying particular attention to the winter months when the cold was most extreme and food most scarce. What they found was striking. During the depths of Ice Age winter, the large herbivores that humans hunted would have been living off their body reserves, having depleted the easily accessible body fat that they built up during more abundant seasons. These animals survived winter by carefully managing their energy reserves, and by late winter they would be quite lean. Their bodies would still contain substantial protein in the form of muscle tissue, but they would be relatively depleted of the fat that humans needed to balance their diet. When hunters brought down these lean animals, they faced a nutritional conundrum. The animals provided far more lean meat than the hunters could safely consume. Humans needed fat, needed it desperately in the cold where simply maintaining body temperature required enormous caloric expenditure. The nutritional calculations show that humans would have selectively targeted the fattiest parts of the kill. Bone marrow, which remains fatty even when animals are lean, certain organ meats, deposits of fat around internal organs, and grease that could be rendered from bones through boiling. This selective processing would leave substantial amounts of lean muscle meat. Not spoiled meat, not undesirable meat, but lean protein that the humans simply couldn't safely consume in the quantities that would be left over after taking the parts they needed most. This is the protein paradox. In the depths of Ice Age winter, when meat was the only food source available in many regions, successful hunters would paradoxically have a surplus of lean meat they couldn't eat. For wolves, this surplus represented an extraordinary opportunity. Wolves, as specialized carnivores, don't have the same limitations on protein consumption that humans do. Their digestive systems and metabolism are adapted to process large quantities of protein efficiently. They can, and in the wild often do, derive the vast majority of their caloric intake from protein without the negative effects that humans would experience. A diet consisting almost entirely of lean meat would be perfectly acceptable to a wolf. This creates a remarkable complementarity. Humans needed the fattiest parts of prey animals and couldn't safely consume too much lean protein. Wolves could thrive on lean protein that humans couldn't eat. Rather than both species competing for the same resources, they could potentially partition a kill in a way that gave each species what it needed without denying the other access to essential nutrients. The researchers who developed this theory, led by archaeologist Maria Lahtinen of the Finnish Food Authority, calculated the nutritional content of the various Ice Age prey species and determined that for all but one of 28 potential food sources, the amount of protein a successful hunt would yield would have been too high to be consumed entirely by humans without risking protein poisoning. The excess had to go somewhere. It could be left at the kill site, allowing scavengers to consume it. It could be given to the wolves that increasingly hung around human camps, serving as a kind of payment for their presence and the services they provided, intentionally or not. This theory has profound implications for understanding the domestication process. It suggests that sharing food with wolves wasn't necessarily an act of generosity or a deliberate strategy to domesticate wolves, but rather a practical response to a nutritional reality. Humans had more lean protein than they could use, wolves could make use of it, and both species benefited from the arrangement. The foundation of the human-dog partnership might have been built not on deliberate breeding programs or elaborate plans, but on simple mutual benefit arising from complementary nutritional needs. Evidence supporting this hypothesis comes from multiple sources. When researchers examined the stable isotope signatures in bones from both ancient humans and ancient wolves from the same time periods and locations, they found interesting patterns. Stable isotopes are versions of elements that don't decay radioactively, and their ratios in bone tissue can reveal information about diet. Different food sources have different isotopic signatures, and these signatures are preserved in the bones of animals that consume those foods. The isotopic analysis showed that both humans and wolves in these environments were heavily dependent on meat from large herbivores, which makes sense given the scarcity of other food sources during winter. But the specific isotopic patterns also suggested that wolves and humans were consuming somewhat different portions of these animals, consistent with humans focusing on fattier tissues and wolves consuming more lean muscle meat. Additionally, archaeological sites from this period sometimes show evidence of extensive processing of animal carcasses, with many bones showing cut marks and impact fractures from humans working to extract every possible bit of marrow and grease. At the same time, these sites often have wolf or early dog remains, suggesting the animals were present and likely consuming the portions humans didn't want. The protein paradox theory also helps explain the timing of wolf domestication. While dogs could theoretically have been domesticated at any point when humans and wolves overlapped geographically, the process appears to have accelerated during the coldest periods of the Ice Age, precisely when this nutritional complementarity would have been most pronounced. In warmer periods, when plant foods were more available and prey animals were fattier, the advantage of having wolves around would have been less dramatic. But when winter gripped the land for months at a time, when stored plant foods were exhausted and fresh vegetation was buried under snow and ice, when every hunt was crucial and prey animals were lean, the ability to share the kill with wolves in a mutually beneficial way could have made a real difference in survival. This theory doesn't suggest that nutrition was the only factor in domestication or that all human groups for all time periods depended on this mechanism. Dog domestication was almost certainly a complex process with multiple factors contributing and varying from place to place. But the protein paradox provides a compelling explanation for why wolves and humans, against all ecological odds, might have found it advantageous to tolerate each other's presence, to share resources, and eventually to form the bonds that would lead to full domestication. The implications extend beyond just explaining how domestication started. If humans were regularly sharing lean meat with wolves, this would create predictable feeding opportunities for the wolves. Natural selection would favor wolves that could reliably access these resources, which meant wolves that could approach human camps without triggering aggressive responses, that could communicate their intentions in ways humans could interpret as non-threatening, and that could coexist with both humans and other wolves in the limited space around human settlements. Over generations, these selection pressures would shape wolf populations living near humans. Aggressive individuals would be less successful because they'd be driven off or killed. Extremely fearful individuals would miss feeding opportunities. The successful wolves would be those with just the right temperament. Cautious but not paralyzing fearful, capable of approaching humans but not aggressive or threatening, able to read human body language and respond appropriately, tolerant of the sights, sounds, and smells of human habitation. These behavioral changes would have genetic underpinnings. Temperament and behavior have complex genetic bases involving many genes, but they are heritable, passed from parents to offspring. As selection operated on behavior, it was simultaneously selecting specific genetic variants that influenced that behavior. Over time, the wolf populations around human settlements would become genetically distinct from wolves living away from humans, not through humans deliberately choosing which wolves to breed, but through natural selection operating in the unique ecological niche created by human presence. This is the self-domestication hypothesis, or the commensal scavenger model, and it has become one of the leading explanations for the early stages of dog domestication. It proposes that wolves essentially domesticated themselves by adapting to exploit resources around human settlements, with humans playing a relatively passive role initially, neither actively encouraging nor actively preventing the process. The wolf pups born in these proto-domestic populations would have grown up in a very different world than their wild cousins. Instead of learning to be wary of humans from their earliest experiences, they would have been exposed to human presence as a normal part of their environment. Instead of developing the full predatory suite of behaviors needed for successful hunting in the wild, they might have learned to rely at least partially on scavenging and on the food-sharing relationship with humans. Instead of seeing humans as competitors or threats, they would have learned to see them as potential providers of resources. As generations passed, the differences between these proto-domestic wolves and fully wild wolves would have become more pronounced. The proto-domestic animals would have been less aggressive, more tolerant of humans, more willing to approach and interact with people. They might have retained some juvenile characteristics into adulthood, a phenomenon called neoteny, because in the context of living with humans, retaining youthful playfulness and curiosity could be advantageous. At some point in this process, humans would have begun to notice that these wolves behaved differently than wild wolves. Perhaps children playing near the edges of camps interacted with young wolves, forming bonds that persisted into adulthood. Perhaps hunters noticed that certain wolves would follow hunting parties, not to steal kills but to help locate prey or to clean up after kills were processed. Perhaps alert wolves barking at approaching predators or strangers saved lives, making their value undeniable. Once humans began to actively value these animals, the relationship would have entered a new phase. Instead of merely tolerating wolves that hung around camps, humans might have actively encouraged it, deliberately sharing food even when there wasn't excess lean meat, protecting friendly wolves from aggressive ones, perhaps even beginning to influence which animals bred by driving off aggressive individuals or protecting particularly useful or friendly ones. This transition from passive tolerance to active partnership wouldn't have happened overnight or uniformly. Different human groups would have had different relationships with wolf populations. Some groups might have actively discouraged wolves from approaching. Others might have developed deep partnerships. The archaeological record suggests substantial variability across time and space in how humans and wolves interacted. But where the relationship did develop, it set in motion processes that would eventually transform wolves into dogs, creating an animal unlike anything that had existed before. A wild creature adapted to living with humans, a predator that could be trusted around human children, a pack hunter whose loyalty had been transferred from wolf pack to human family. The journey was long, spanning thousands of years and countless generations, but the destination was clear even from these early steps. The wolves that learned to share human campfires were on a path that would lead to lapdogs and livestock guardians, to sled dogs and seeing-eye dogs, to the astonishing diversity of forms and functions that characterize dogs today. The protein paradox provided the initial incentive, the practical reason why sharing resources made sense for both species. But the relationship that grew from this practical beginning would become something far more profound, a bond that transcended mere utility and became one of the most emotionally significant relationships in human history. The transformation of wolves into dogs required changes so profound that they affected not just behavior but also physiology, genetics, brain structure, and development. These changes weren't random, and they weren't entirely the result of humans deliberately breeding wolves to create specific traits. Instead, many of the most characteristic differences between dogs and wolves arose through a fascinating process that scientists call the domestication syndrome, a suite of changes that appear consistently across many different species that have been domesticated, from dogs to foxes to cattle to pigs. Understanding the domestication syndrome requires us to explore some sophisticated biology, but the journey is worth taking because it reveals one of the most elegant principles in evolutionary biology: how selecting for one trait, particularly a behavioral trait like reduced aggression or increased tameness, can trigger cascades of correlated changes throughout an organism's entire body and life cycle. The story begins with perhaps the most famous experiment in the study of domestication. work that began in 1959 in the Soviet Union under geneticist Dmitry Belyaev. Belyaev was interested in understanding how domestication worked at a fundamental level. He chose to work with silver foxes, which are essentially a melanistic form of the red fox, because foxes had never been fully domesticated and because they could be bred in captivity with relatively short generation times, allowing him to observe evolutionary change across many generations within a human lifetime. The experiment was remarkably simple in concept. Belyaev and his team would test young foxes for their reaction to human handlers. The foxes that showed the least fear and aggression toward humans, those that were most curious or friendly or at least most tolerant of human presence, were allowed to breed. The most aggressive or fearful foxes were not bred. No other selection was applied. The experimenters weren't trying to breed for size or coat color or ear shape or any physical characteristic. They were selecting purely for tameness, for reduced fear-aggression response to humans. The results were astonishing. Within just a few generations, the selected foxes were showing marked behavioral changes. They were more willing to approach humans, showed less stress when handled, were more tolerant of unfamiliar situations. But more remarkably, they were also showing physical changes that hadn't been selected for at all. Some of the foxes began to develop floppy ears instead of the erect, pointed ears characteristic of wild foxes. Their tails began to curl upward rather than hanging straight. Their coats developed patches of different colors, white spotting and other patterns never seen in wild foxes. Their snouts became shorter and their skulls somewhat broader, giving them a more puppyish appearance. They began to retain juvenile behavioral traits into adulthood, including more playfulness and more vocalizations. Some even began to bark, something wild foxes essentially never do. These physical changes appeared in the experimental population despite never being deliberately selected for. The researchers chose breeding animals based solely on behavior, yet they were getting profound changes in morphology as well. This wasn't a unique quirk of foxes. When researchers examined other domesticated species and compared them to their wild ancestors, they found similar patterns. Domestic dogs compared to wolves, domestic pigs compared to wild boars, domestic cattle compared to aurochs, domestic ducks compared to wild mallards. In each case, the domestic form showed a predictable set of changes that included things like floppy ears, curly tails, shortened snouts, smaller brains relative to body size, changes in coat color and pattern, and retention of juvenile behaviors into adulthood. The question was, why? Why should selecting for reduced aggression or increased tameness cause changes in completely unrelated traits like ear position or tail curl or coat color? The answer lies in the biology of development and the way complex organisms are built from simple beginnings. All animals, including foxes and wolves and humans, begin life as a single cell, the fertilized egg. That single cell divides repeatedly, creating first a ball of cells, then a more organized structure with different layers, then gradually the recognizable form of the animal. But not all cells become the same kind of tissue. Some become skin, some become bone, some become muscle, some become nerve tissue. The process by which undifferentiated cells become specialized is called development, and it's governed by intricate gene regulatory networks that control which genes are turned on or off in which cells at which times. One of the most important cell types in vertebrate development is the neural crest cell. Neural crest cells form early in development along the edges of what will become the nervous system. These cells then migrate throughout the developing embryo and give rise to an astounding variety of structures. They form much of the skull and facial bones. They contribute to the formation of pigment cells that give color to skin and hair. They help form the cartilage of the ears. They contribute to parts of the adrenal glands, which produce stress hormones like adrenaline and cortisol. They even contribute to the formation of parts of the heart and the development of parts of the nervous system. Because neural crest cells contribute to so many different structures, anything that affects neural crest cell function, migration, or proliferation during development will have widespread effects throughout the body. If neural crest cells migrate slightly differently, or proliferate slightly less, or differentiate slightly differently, the result could be changes in facial structure, ear cartilage, pigmentation, adrenal function, and nervous system development all at once. Research into the domestication syndrome suggests that selection for tameness may work in part by selecting for subtle changes in neural crest cell biology. Tameness and reduced aggression are related to how an animal's nervous system responds to stressful or threatening situations. They involve the functioning of the adrenal glands and the production of stress hormones. They involve brain structures like the amygdala that process fear and aggression. All of these systems are influenced by neurocrest cell development. When you select for animals that are less fearful and less aggressive, you're selecting for animals whose stress response systems are somewhat less reactive. These animals have slightly lower stress hormone levels, slightly different neural processing of threatening situations, slightly reduced fight or flight responses. The genetic changes that produce these behavioral differences may involve genes that affect neural crest cell function. And because neural crest cells contribute to so many different structures, changing neural crest development to reduce fearfulness and aggression can incidentally change ear cartilage, facial bones, and pigmentation as well. This is called pleiotropy, when a single gene or developmental process affects multiple traits. It explains why the domestication syndrome appears so consistently across different species. You don't need to separately select for floppy ears and curly tails and white spots. You just need to select for reduced fearfulness, and the other changes come along for the ride because they're developmentally linked to the changes in nervous system function that underlie tameness. The implications for understanding dog domestication are profound. The physical differences we see between dogs and wolves, things like floppy ears in many breeds, curly tails, variable coat colors with patterns like white spotting that are rare or absent in wolves, shorter snouts and broader skulls in many breeds, all of these could have arisen not through deliberate selection but as correlated responses to selection for tameness and reduced aggression. The earliest proto-dogs, the wolves that were most successful at living around humans, would have been those with reduced fear-aggression responses. These animals were more likely to approach humans to scavenge, more tolerant of the sights and sounds of human camps, less likely to react aggressively to human presence. As these animals bred preferentially, perhaps because they were more successful at accessing food resources around humans or because humans tolerated them while driving off more aggressive wolves, their genes became more common in the population. Along with the behavioral changes came the correlated physical changes. The puppies of these proto-dogs would have been more likely to have floppy ears or curly tails or unusual coat colors than the puppies of wild wolves. These physical changes wouldn't have been selected against because they didn't significantly reduce survival or reproduction. And they might even have been slightly favored if humans found the puppyish appearance endearing and were therefore more tolerant of these animals. Modern genetic research has provided support for this hypothesis by identifying specific genes involved in both behavior and morphology in dogs. One particularly interesting cluster of genes is related to Williams-Beuren syndrome in humans. People with this syndrome, caused by deletion of specific genes, show hypersociability, often being extremely friendly and trusting even toward strangers, along with certain physical features. In dogs, variations in this same region of the genome are associated with hypersociability toward humans. When researchers compared dog genomes to wolf genomes, they found that dogs showed evidence of selection on genes involved in neural crest development, exactly as the domestication syndrome hypothesis would predict. They also found evidence of selection on genes involved in starch digestion, an adaptation that makes sense given that dogs living with humans would have had access to human food scraps including starchy plant foods, while wolves were exclusively carnivorous. The behavioral changes involved in domestication went beyond just reduced aggression. Dogs developed an enhanced ability to read human communicative signals. In comparative studies, dogs consistently outperform wolves, even wolves raised by humans from puppyhood, in tasks that involve interpreting human gestures like pointing. When a human points at one of two containers, dogs reliably understand that the pointing gesture indicates which container has food hidden in it. Wolves, even with extensive human socialization, perform much worse at this task. This ability wasn't trained into dogs. Puppies as young as a few weeks old, with minimal human interaction, can follow human pointing gestures at levels that exceed not just wolves but also our closest primate relatives like chimpanzees. This suggests that the ability to interpret human communicative signals has been selected for during domestication, becoming a hardwired part of dog cognition. For dogs living with humans, the ability to understand what humans wanted, to interpret human intentions and communications, would have been enormously advantageous, leading to selection for enhanced sensitivity to human signals. Dogs also show behavioral neoteny, the retention of juvenile behavioral characteristics into adulthood. Wolf pups are playful, curious, and attention-seeking, but as they mature, These behaviors decrease and are replaced by more serious adult behaviors focused on hunting, territorial defense, and social dominance. Many dogs retain puppyish behaviors throughout their lives. They continue to play well into adulthood. They seek attention from humans in ways that resemble puppies seeking attention from mother wolves. They show facial expressions, particularly the wide-eyed, head-tilted expression that humans find endearing, far more often than adult wolves do. This neoteny wasn't accidental. In the context of living with humans, retaining juvenile behaviors was advantageous. Humans generally respond more positively to animals that look and behave like juveniles. The evolutionary biologist Stephen Jay Gould wrote extensively about how juvenile features, things like large eyes relative to head size, rounded features, and playful behavior, trigger nurturing responses in adult humans. Dogs that retain these features were more likely to be tolerated, protected, and cared for by humans, giving them a significant survival and reproductive advantage. The vocal behavior of dogs also changed during domestication. Wolves vocalize certainly with howls, growls, whines, and barks, but barking is relatively rare in adult wolves and typically occurs only in specific contexts like alarm calling. Dogs bark far more frequently and in a much wider variety of contexts. They bark when excited, when seeking attention, when playing, when alerting to strangers, and in many other situations. They've developed a vocabulary of different barks that convey different meanings, which experienced dog owners can often interpret. Some researchers suggest that increased barking was favored during domestication because it made dogs more useful as guards and sentinels. A dog that barks when strangers approach provides an early warning system. Humans may have actively encouraged this behavior, or at least tolerated it despite the noise, because of its practical value. Over time, dogs that barked more reliably in response to novel stimuli or potential threats would have been more valuable to human groups, leading to selection for increased barking. The social behavior of dogs also shifted in fundamental ways. While wolves are highly social animals that live in packs with complex hierarchies and relationships, they typically form strong bonds only with their pack members and are wary or aggressive toward outsiders. Dogs, in contrast, form strong attachments to humans, even humans they've only recently met. They show affection, seek physical contact, make eye contact, and display clear signs of emotional attachment in ways that are unusual for wild animals. This attachment isn't just learned behavior. Dogs raised with minimal human contact still show preference for human company over being alone. When given a choice, dogs will often choose to spend time with humans over other dogs. They show separation anxiety when separated from their human companions. They synchronize their behavior with humans, often adjusting their pace to match a walking human or looking to humans for guidance in uncertain situations. The neurochemistry underlying this attachment has been studied extensively. When dogs and humans interact positively, both species experience increases in oxytocin, often called the bonding hormone because of its role in parent-infant attachment and social bonding generally. When a dog makes eye contact with its human companion, oxytocin levels rise in both the dog and the human. This creates a positive feedback loop. The dog looks at the human, both feel good, the dog is reinforced for making eye contact and does it more, the human responds positively, the bond strengthens. Remarkably, wolves don't show this same oxytocin response to human eye contact. Even wolves raised from puppyhood by humans and socialized extensively with people don't exhibit the same oxytocin-mediated bonding response that dogs show. This suggests that the neurochemical basis for the human-dog bond has been altered during domestication, likely through selection on genes involved in oxytocin production, receptor sensitivity, or the neural circuits that process social information. The physical changes in dogs went beyond the traits associated with domestication syndrome. Over time, as dogs began to perform different functions for different human groups, they diversified dramatically in size, shape, coat type, and other physical characteristics. Some dogs were bred to be smaller for companionship or for hunting small prey in burrows. Others were bred to be larger for guarding or hunting large game. Some were bred for speed, others for strength, others for endurance in harsh climates. This diversification into what we now recognize as breeds happened relatively recently in evolutionary terms, mostly within the last few thousand years and accelerating dramatically in the last few centuries as humans began deliberately creating breeds for specific purposes and aesthetic preferences. But the foundation for this diversity was laid during the initial domestication process. when the genetic architecture of the dog was first loosened from the constraints that kept wolves relatively uniform in appearance across their range. The process of self-domestication, guided by natural selection operating in the unique niche created by human presence, transformed wolves into proto-dogs over thousands of years. These animals weren't yet dogs in the modern sense. They probably looked much more like wolves than like the diverse breeds we see today. But they behaved differently, thought differently, and related to humans in ways that wild wolves simply don't and can't. The success of this transformation is evident in its persistence. Once the domestication process crossed a certain threshold, it became self-reinforcing. Dogs that were better adapted to living with humans were more successful in that niche. Humans, even when not deliberately trying to breed dogs for specific traits, naturally favored the animals they found most useful, most appealing, or least troublesome. The separation between dogs and wolves became increasingly pronounced, not through any impassable genetic barrier but through accumulated behavioral and physical differences that made crossing back increasingly unlikely. This was the survival of the friendliest, a process in which the least aggressive, most tolerant, most socially sensitive wolves found a new ecological niche and evolved to fill it, becoming in the process a new kind of creature. The dog, humanity's first and oldest domesticated animal, a companion whose ancestors made the remarkable transition from wild predator to trusted friend during the frozen millennia of the Ice Age. While the external changes in dogs, the floppy ears and curly tails and varied coat colors, are the most immediately visible signs of domestication, the truly revolutionary changes happened at a level invisible to the naked eye. In the genome, in the specific sequences of DNA that carry the instructions for building and running a living organism. Modern genetic technology has allowed us to peer into these molecular blueprints and see exactly how dogs differ from wolves at the most fundamental level, revealing a story of selection, adaptation, and evolutionary creativity that is still being written today. The dog genome was first fully sequenced in 2004, using DNA from a boxer named Tasha. This milestone represented a massive undertaking, requiring years of work and significant computational resources to assemble the approximately 2.4 billion base pairs of DNA that make up the dog genome. Since then, researchers have sequenced hundreds of dog genomes representing diverse breeds and populations, along with genomes from wolves from various regions and time periods, creating an incredibly rich data set for comparative analysis. When scientists compared dog genomes to wolf genomes, they weren't looking for completely different genes. Dogs and wolves are the same species in biological terms, or at least so closely related that the distinction between species and subspecies becomes somewhat semantic. They can interbreed and produce fertile offspring. They share the vast majority of their DNA, just as humans share roughly 99% of our DNA with chimpanzees and bonobos. The differences are subtle but profound, involving not the presence or absence of genes but rather variations in how genes are regulated, when they're turned on or off, and subtle differences in the protein products they encode. One of the first things researchers noticed was that dogs showed clear signatures of selection on specific regions of the genome. When a particular genetic variant becomes very advantageous, it increases in frequency in a population rapidly in evolutionary terms, and this rapid increase leaves telltale signatures in the surrounding DNA that geneticists can detect. These signatures appear as regions where genetic diversity is reduced compared to surrounding areas because all individuals carry essentially the same variant that was selected for, along with the DNA that was linked to it. In dogs, these selection signatures appeared in clusters, groups of genes located near each other on the chromosome that all showed evidence of selection. This makes sense because genes that work together in developmental pathways or biological processes are often located near each other. And selecting for a change in one gene might also select for changes in nearby genes that interact with it. Several gene clusters stood out as particularly important. One cluster on chromosome 6 includes genes involved in brain development and function, particularly genes that affect neural crest cell development and migration. This finding was exactly what the domestication syndrome hypothesis predicted. Selection for behavioral changes like reduced aggression and increased sociability would involve changes in genes that affect nervous system development. And because these genes also influence neural crest cells, they would have widespread effects throughout the body. Within this cluster, researchers identified specific genes that have been implicated in human behavioral conditions. For example, variants in genes associated with Williams-Beuren syndrome in humans, a condition characterized by hypersociability and reduced social anxiety, shows strong signatures of selection in dogs. Dogs tend to have more copies of these genes than wolves, and the specific variants present in dogs differ from those typical of wolves in ways that likely affect their function. This is fascinating because it suggests that the social behavior that makes dogs such compatible companions for humans may result from changes in the same genetic systems that, when disrupted in humans, lead to unusual social behaviors. The hypersociability of people with Williams-Bierman syndrome has both challenges and benefits. But in the context of dog domestication, selecting for variants that increased sociability toward humans would have been highly advantageous. And apparently the genetic changes that produced this effect were similar to those involved in human social behavior disorders. Another important genetic change involved the dog's ability to digest starch. Wolves are obligate carnivores, meaning their natural diet consists almost exclusively of meat. Their digestive systems are optimized for processing protein and fat, and they have relatively low levels of enzymes needed to break down complex carbohydrates like starch. Humans, being omnivores, have much higher levels of amylase, an enzyme that breaks down starch into simpler sugars that can be absorbed and used for energy. When researchers examined the genes for amylase production in dogs versus wolves, they found that dogs have multiple copies of the amylase gene, while wolves typically have only one or two copies. Having more gene copies means producing more enzyme, which allows more efficient starch digestion. This genetic change would have been highly advantageous for dogs living with humans because human food scraps would have included cooked plant foods like grains, roots, and other starchy foods. Dogs that could digest these foods efficiently could exploit a food source unavailable to wolves, giving them an advantage in the commensal niche around human settlements. Interestingly, the number of amylase gene copies varies among dog breeds and populations, with some breeds having more copies than others. This variation suggests that the selection pressure for starch digestion varied depending on the diet of the human populations the dogs lived with. Dogs living with agricultural societies that relied heavily on grain crops may have experienced stronger selection for high amylase production than dogs living with human groups that relied more on hunting and fishing. Changes in coat color and pattern are among the most obvious differences between dogs and wolves. Wolves typically have a fairly restricted range of coat colors, usually variations of gray, brown, and black, with patterns that provide camouflage in their natural habitats. Dogs show an extraordinary range of colors and patterns, from solid white to solid black, from tan to brindle to merle patterns, from spotted to patched to combinations that would never occur in wild wolves. These color differences result from changes in genes involved in pigmentation. Melanin, the pigment that colors hair, skin, and eyes, comes in two main forms: eumelanin, which is dark brown to black, and pheomelanin, which is yellow to red. The production, distribution, and deposition of these pigments is controlled by numerous genes, and changes in any of them can alter color and pattern. In dogs, researchers have identified specific mutations in pigmentation genes that never occur in wild wolf populations or occur at extremely low frequencies. For example, mutations that prevent eumelanin production result in yellow or red coats. Mutations that cause irregular distribution of pigment produce spotted or patched patterns. Some of these mutations would be disadvantageous in the wild, making an animal more visible to prey or predators. But in the context of living with humans, they were neutral or even advantageous if humans found the unusual colors appealing. The genetics of coat color have become so well understood that researchers can now often predict a dog's color and pattern from its genome alone, and can trace the evolutionary history of specific color variants. For instance, the mutation causing the merle pattern, a mottled or patched appearance, can be dated to a specific time period and appears to have arisen relatively recently and then spread through certain dog populations. Changes in the size and structure of the skull and face are obvious differences between most dogs and wolves. Wolves have long snouts, large teeth, and powerful jaws adapted for gripping and tearing. Many dog breeds have shorter snouts, smaller teeth relative to skull size, and less powerful bites. These changes involve numerous genes that regulate bone growth, tooth development, and the formation of muscles and connective tissues. Research has identified several genes particularly important in determining skull shape in dogs. One gene, called RUNX2, is involved in bone development, and variants of this gene are associated with the short, broad skulls characteristic of breeds like bulldogs and pugs. Another gene cluster affects the length of the snout, and selection on these genes has produced the extreme variation we see, from the extremely short faces of some toy breeds to the long snouts of breeds like greyhounds and borzois. These changes in skull structure have important functional consequences. Short-snout breeds often have dental crowding, breathing difficulties, and other health issues because their teeth and soft tissues haven't scaled down as dramatically as their skull bones. Understanding the genetic basis of these changes helps researchers understand not just how dogs evolved, but also how to address the health problems that some breeding practices have inadvertently created. Brain size relative to body size is another significant difference between dogs and wolves. Wolves have larger brains relative to their body size than dogs of equivalent body weight. This might seem counterintuitive, since dogs show sophisticated cognitive abilities in their interactions with humans, but the difference makes sense when we consider what each species needs its brain for. Wolves need to navigate complex social hierarchies within their packs, remember vast territories and the locations of resources within them, coordinate sophisticated group hunts, and survive in unpredictable environments where they must constantly assess threats and opportunities. This requires substantial cognitive firepower, and the wolf brain, particularly regions involved in spatial memory and sensory processing, is adapted for these challenges. Dogs, living with humans, are buffered from many of these challenges. They don't need to maintain mental maps of huge territories because they live in or around human settlements. They don't need to coordinate complex hunts because they're fed by humans or can scavenge human food waste. They don't need the same level of sensory processing for threat detection because humans provide protection. In this context, maintaining a large brain, which is metabolically expensive, requiring substantial energy to run, may not be worth the cost. However, dogs have developed cognitive abilities that wolves lack, particularly in the social domain. The regions of the dog brain involved in processing social information from humans, in interpreting human gestures and expressions, and in bonding with humans may actually be more developed than the equivalent regions in wolf brains. Brain evolution involves trade-offs, and dogs appear to have traded some of the cognitive abilities useful for wild survival for enhanced abilities in the domain of human-dog social interaction. Recent research using functional brain imaging has allowed scientists to observe the brains of awake, behaving dogs as they process various types of information. These studies have revealed that when dogs look at human faces, particular regions of their brains activate, regions involved in processing social and emotional information. When dogs hear words of praise and enthusiastic tones from their owners, reward centers in the brain light up. The patterns of brain activity are remarkably similar to what we see in human brains during social interactions, suggesting that dogs have evolved neural circuitry specifically adapted for forming and maintaining social bonds with humans. The genetic changes underlying all these differences accumulated gradually over many generations. The initial domestication probably involved relatively few genetic changes, primarily in systems controlling fear and aggression. As the process continued and dogs began to live more closely with humans and eventually to be bred for specific purposes, additional genetic changes accumulated, producing the diversity we see today. One of the most remarkable findings from genetic studies is just how recent much of this diversification has been. While the split between dogs and wolves occurred somewhere between 20,000 and 40,000 years ago, most modern dog breeds are less than a few hundred years old. The Victorian era saw an explosion of dog breeding as kennel clubs were established and breed standards formalized. During this period, breeders intentionally selected for extreme variations in size, shape, coat type, and behavior, creating the hundreds of distinct breeds we recognize today. This recent diversification was possible because domestication had already loosened the genetic constraints that keep wild populations relatively uniform. In the wild, extreme variants are typically selected against because they reduce fitness, the ability to survive and reproduce. But in the protected environment of human care, where humans control breeding and ensure the survival even of animals that couldn't make it in the wild, extreme variations can not only survive but can be deliberately perpetuated and exaggerated. The result is that different dog breeds can appear more different from each other than many species that diverged millions of years ago. A Chihuahua and a Great Dane look like they should be different species, yet they're both dogs, both Canis lupus familiaris, both capable in principle of interbreeding, though practical considerations of size often prevent it. This extraordinary diversity within a single species is a testament to the power of artificial selection, human-directed breeding that can produce changes far more rapidly than natural selection typically operates. Modern genetic research continues to reveal new insights into dog domestication and diversity. Researchers have now sequenced genomes from ancient dogs and wolves spanning thousands of years, allowing them to track genetic changes through time and space. These studies have revealed that dog domestication was more complex than a single event in one place and time. There appear to have been multiple populations of dogs or proto-dogs in different regions, with some populations contributing more to modern dog ancestry than others, and with gene flow between dogs and wolves occurring sporadically throughout history. The genetic toolkit that researchers use to study dog evolution continues to improve. New sequencing technologies can now determine the entire genome sequence of an individual animal in days rather than years, at a fraction of the cost of early sequencing efforts. Advanced statistical methods can detect even subtle signatures of selection and trace the movement of specific genetic variants through populations over time. Researchers can now even recover and sequence DNA from ancient bones thousands of years old, opening windows into the past that would have been impossible just a decade or two ago. These genetic insights don't just satisfy scientific curiosity, they have practical applications. Understanding which genetic variants cause specific health problems in different breeds can lead to better breeding practices that reduce the frequency of genetic diseases. Identifying the genes responsible for behavioral traits can help in breeding working dogs like service animals or search and rescue dogs. Tracing the genetic history of dogs helps us understand not just canine evolution but also human history, as dog populations often followed human migrations and trade routes, carrying genetic markers that can help reconstruct these movements. The genetic revolution in understanding dogs is far from over. Each new genome sequence, each new ancient DNA sample, each new analytical method adds pieces to the puzzle. We now understand in remarkable detail how dogs differ from wolves at the molecular level, which specific genetic changes were most important in domestication, and how the incredible diversity of modern dogs was generated from their wolf ancestors. This knowledge connects us across the millennia to those first humans and wolves who began the partnership that would transform both species, a partnership written not just in the historical record or archaeological remains but in the very code of life itself, in the DNA sequences that make a dog and not a wolf. The transformation of wolves into dogs happened not in a laboratory or through written records but out in the real world, across thousands of years and thousands of miles, leaving behind traces that archaeologists work to piece together into a coherent story. The archaeological record of dog domestication is frustratingly incomplete in some ways, as ancient bones can be ambiguous and preservation varies tremendously depending on environmental conditions. But the evidence that has been found paints a picture of domestication beginning deep in the past and spreading gradually across the Old World. Determining whether a bone is from a wolf or an early dog is more challenging than it might seem. Modern dogs and wolves are easy to tell apart in most cases because they've diverged substantially in size, skull shape, and other skeletal features. But early dogs, in the initial stages of domestication, would have looked much more like wolves than like modern dogs. The differences would have been subtle, requiring careful measurement and analysis to detect. Archaeologists look for several features when trying to distinguish early dog remains from wolf remains. Skull shape can be informative, with dogs typically having shorter, broader skulls and shorter snouts than wolves, but these differences are subtle in early specimens. Tooth size relative to jaw size can be another clue, as domestication often involves some reduction in tooth size. The width of the palate, the roof of the mouth, tends to be relatively wider in dogs than wolves. Body size can sometimes help, as some early dogs were smaller than typical wolves, though size is variable in both species and can be hard to estimate from fragmentary remains. Context is also crucial. A canine skeleton found buried carefully with human remains is more likely to be a dog than a wolf. A canine found within a human settlement, especially in positions suggesting it lived there rather than being processed as prey, is more likely to be a dog. Evidence of pathologies or injuries that healed, suggesting the animal was cared for or at least tolerated despite being unable to hunt, can support identification as a dog. The presence of multiple canid individuals of different ages at a human site suggests a breeding population living with humans, which would be highly unusual for wolves. The oldest generally accepted evidence of dogs comes from multiple sites across Eurasia, with specimens dating to roughly 15,000 years ago being widely accepted as representing domestic dogs. One of the most famous early dog burials is from Bonn Castle in Germany, dated to approximately 14,200 years ago. At this site, archaeologists found the remains of two humans, a man and a woman roughly 40 and 25 years old respectively, buried alongside a dog estimated to have been about 7 months old at death. The Bonn Castle dog was clearly treated with care and respect. It was deliberately placed in the grave with the humans, suggesting it was valued and mourned. Analysis of the dog's remains revealed evidence of disease, likely canine distemper, that would have manifested when the dog was about 19 weeks old. The disease would have caused severe symptoms including fever, diarrhea, and neurological problems. For the dog to survive another 8 weeks, reaching an age of about 28 weeks before dying, it must have received care from humans, as a sick puppy couldn't have fended for itself. This speaks volumes about the relationship between these ancient humans and this dog. They cared for a sick puppy, investing time and resources to keep it alive even though it wasn't contributing to group survival and might never recover. This isn't the behavior you'd show toward a merely tolerated scavenger or a useful tool. This is the behavior of people who had formed an emotional bond with the animal, who saw it as part of their group, worthy of care and eventually worthy of being buried with human companions. Another significant early dog specimen comes from Goyet Cave in Belgium, dated to approximately 36,500 years ago. This specimen is more controversial, as it falls within the very early range when wolves and proto-dogs might have been difficult to distinguish. However, analysis of the skull shape and proportions suggests it falls outside the range of variation typical for wolves and within the range expected for early domestic dogs. The context is also suggestive, as the remains were found in association with human artifacts and appear to have been deposited deliberately. In Siberia, researchers have found early dog remains dated to roughly 33,000 years ago from sites associated with human occupation. Analysis of these specimens in their archaeological context suggests they represent early stages of domestication, animals that were living in association with humans and showing early morphological changes distinguishing them from wild wolves. From the Altai Mountains in Russia, a region famous for spectacular archaeological preservation in frozen ground, comes another early candidate for dog domestication. A specimen found there and dated to approximately 33,000 years ago shows morphological features intermediate between wolves and dogs, possibly representing an early phase of the domestication process. Each of these ancient specimens has been debated by researchers. Some scientists argue for earlier domestication dates based on subtle morphological features, while others contend that distinguishing early dogs from wolves is so difficult that we should only accept specimens showing clear and unambiguous dog characteristics, which would push the date of accepted domestication more recently. This scholarly debate isn't mere pedantry, it reflects genuine challenges in interpreting fragmentary evidence from deep in the past. The geographic distribution of these early finds is significant. They're concentrated in Europe and northeastern Asia, regions where both humans and wolves were abundant during the late Pleistocene. This distribution has led to debates about where domestication first occurred. Some researchers argue for a single origin, perhaps in Europe or Western Asia, with dogs then spreading along with humans to other regions. Others suggest multiple independent domestications, with proto-dogs emerging separately in different regions where humans and wolves coexisted under similar conditions. Genetic evidence has weighed in on this debate, though not definitively settled it. Analysis of modern and ancient dog genomes suggests that all modern dogs descend primarily from Eastern Eurasian ancestor populations, with later gene flow from other sources. However, there's also evidence that there may have been early dog or proto-dog populations in Western Eurasia that contributed to modern dog ancestry but weren't the primary source. The picture that emerges is complex, with possible multiple domestication events or at least multiple distinct populations of early dogs that subsequently intermixed. As we move forward in time, the evidence for dogs becomes more abundant and less ambiguous. By roughly 12,000 years ago, during the transition from the Pleistocene to the Holocene epoch that marked the end of the Ice Age, dog remains are found at archaeological sites across much of Eurasia and have even reached the Americas, brought by human groups migrating across the Bering Land Bridge. These later Mesolithic and early Neolithic dogs show increasing diversity, suggesting that populations in different regions were beginning to diverge as they adapted to different environments and human lifestyles. Dogs in northern regions were larger and more robust, adapted to cold climates and perhaps used for transport. Dogs in warmer regions were sometimes smaller, possibly used for different purposes or experiencing different selection pressures. One remarkable series of burials comes from the Lake Baikal region of Siberia, where archaeologists have found numerous carefully buried dog remains dating from roughly 8,000 to 2,000 years ago. These burials often included grave goods, items deliberately placed with the deceased, and in some cases, the dogs were buried with as much care and ceremony as human graves from the same sites. Some dogs were buried wearing collars made of stone or bone beads. Others were placed in graves lined with stone or covered with earth mounds. The effort invested in these burials speaks to the significance these ancient people placed on their relationship with dogs. From the Near East, the region where agriculture first developed, comes evidence of dogs associated with early farming communities. These dogs were often smaller than wild wolves and showed morphological changes consistent with domestication. They were likely serving multiple functions, guarding settlements and stored grain from wild animals, helping control rodent populations, possibly assisting with hunting and serving as companions. In East Asia, the archaeological record reveals early dogs associated with early rice farming cultures. Analysis of these remains suggests that they may represent a lineage somewhat distinct from Western Eurasian dogs, supporting the idea of multiple domestication events or at least significant geographic structuring of early dog populations. The Americas present a particularly interesting case. Dogs were definitely present in the Americas by at least 10,000 years ago, brought by human groups migrating from Asia. These ancient American dogs show genetic continuity with ancient Asian dog populations, confirming that they came with human migrants rather than being independently domesticated from American wolves. Remarkably, ancient American dog lineages have left relatively little genetic legacy in modern American dogs. Most modern dogs in the Americas descend primarily from European dogs brought after European colonization, with the ancient American dog lineages largely replaced. However, traces of ancient American dog DNA persist in some populations, particularly in remote regions or in specific breeds. Archaeological sites across the Americas have yielded ancient dog remains showing the diversity that had developed by a few thousand years ago. Some were small companion dogs, while others were larger animals possibly used for transport or hunting. Analysis of these remains alongside human remains has revealed that both humans and dogs in some regions showed similar dietary patterns, eating the same types of food, which again suggests close association and sharing of resources. In Australia, the situation was differing. The dingo, Australia's iconic wild dog, is actually a domestic dog that became feral after being brought to Australia by human colonists roughly 3,500 to 4,000 years ago. Dingoes have since adapted to a wild existence, but they retain morphological and behavioral features that mark them as descended from domestic dogs rather than from wolves. The dingo represents an interesting case of de-domestication or feralization, where a domestic animal returns to a wild lifestyle, and it raises questions about how permanent domestication really is and whether dogs could survive without humans. As human societies became more complex, so too did the roles dogs played. With the development of pastoralism, herding livestock became an important function for dogs, and breeds began to be developed specifically for this purpose. Archaeological evidence shows that by a few thousand years ago, dogs of different sizes and shapes were present in some regions, suggesting the beginning of selective breeding for specific traits and purposes. In ancient Egypt, dogs appear frequently in art and were sometimes mummified and buried with considerable care, indicating they held significant cultural importance. Egyptian artwork depicts dogs of various types, from sleek greyhound-like hunting dogs to heavier mastiff-type animals, showing that breed differentiation was already well underway by this time. From ancient Greece and Rome, we have not only archaeological remains but also written descriptions of different types of dogs bred for different purposes. Roman authors describe dogs used for hunting, for guarding, for war, and as companions, and the descriptions suggest that Romans recognized distinct types or breeds, though the concept of breed as we understand it today, with formal standards and closed breeding populations, hadn't yet developed. The archaeological record also preserves evidence of the special bond between humans and dogs through the presence of dog burials in contexts that clearly indicate emotional significance. Dogs buried in human tombs, dogs given their own graves with grave goods, dogs whose bones show evidence of healing from injuries that would have required care. All of these speak to relationships that transcended mere utility. One particularly poignant find comes from Israel, where a Natufian burial site dated to approximately 12,000 years ago revealed a human skeleton with its hand resting on a puppy. The position strongly suggests a deliberate arrangement, the body posed to show connection between the deceased human and the young dog. Whether the dog was sacrificed to accompany the human or died naturally and was placed in the grave is unclear, but either way, the burial demonstrates that by this time, humans and dogs had formed bonds strong enough to be acknowledged in death. Throughout the archaeological record, the trend is clear. Dogs were not just present in human societies, they were woven into the fabric of human life. They appear in human settlements, in human art, in human burials. They show changes in morphology that track the increasing distance from their wolf ancestors. Their distribution follows human migration patterns, expanding to new regions when humans moved and adapting to new environments alongside their human partners. The ancient dogs preserved in the archaeological record were individuals who lived, ate, played, worked, and died alongside the humans of their time. Each bone fragment, each complete skeleton, each burial, represents a real animal that was part of a human community, that formed relationships, that mattered enough to be remembered. The archaeological record may be fragmentary and ambiguous at times, but what it preserves is invaluable. The physical evidence of a partnership that began in the Ice Age and continues unbroken to the present day. The story of wolf domestication is usually told as a story about what humans did to wolves, how we transformed wild predators into domestic companions through selection and breeding. But this framing misses half the story. Domestication wasn't a one-way process where humans actively shaped dogs while remaining unchanged ourselves. Instead, it was a truly coevolutionary relationship, where both species adapted to each other, where both changed in response to the partnership, where the presence of each became an important part of the environment in which the other evolved. The most obvious way that dogs changed human society was by providing services that enhanced human survival and success. Even early proto-dogs, before they were fully domesticated, likely provided benefits that made the humans they associated with more successful than human groups without dogs. These benefits would have created selection pressure favoring humans who could effectively partner with dogs. One of the earliest and most important roles dogs may have filled was as sentinels and guards. Dogs have keener hearing than humans and better scent detection, and they're alert to potential threats in ways that humans, with our primarily visual focus, sometimes miss. A dog sleeping near a campfire might startle awake at sounds or smells that human guards wouldn't notice, alerting the group to approaching predators or hostile human groups. In the dangerous world of the Pleistocene, this early warning system could mean the difference between life and death. This guard function wouldn't have required any training or deliberate breeding. It would simply be a side effect of having dogs around. Dogs bark at novel stimuli, at things that seem unusual or threatening. For humans trying to sleep in temporary camps in a landscape filled with dangerous megafauna and other human groups that might not be friendly, having animals that would sound an alarm when something approached was valuable enough to more than justify sharing food with them. As dogs became more integrated into human groups, their roles expanded. Dogs could help with hunting in ways that increase success rates. While humans are intelligent tool users capable of complex planning, we're not particularly fast runners and we lack the scent tracking abilities that many prey animals use to evade predators. Dogs brought these capabilities to the partnership. A dog or pack of dogs could track wounded prey that might otherwise escape, could drive prey toward waiting human hunters, could help locate game animals through scent when visual scouting came up empty. Archaeological evidence and ethnographic studies of modern hunter-gatherer groups that use dogs suggest that this hunting partnership could be highly effective. Success rates for hunts increase when dogs are involved, both because dogs can help locate and track prey and because the combination of human weapons and dog harassment makes prey more vulnerable. For humans living on the edge of subsistence, where a successful hunt could mean the difference between eating well and going hungry, this increased hunting efficiency was significant. As human societies transitioned from hunting and gathering to agriculture and pastoralism, dogs' roles shifted accordingly. Dogs became invaluable for herding and protecting livestock, for guarding stored grain from rodents and thieves, for protecting settlements from wild animals. Different types of dogs were developed for different functions, with herding dogs bred for the ability to control livestock movement without harming them, guard dogs bred for size and protective instincts, and companion dogs bred for temperament and appearance. These functional roles had profound effects on human society. The ability to keep livestock spread across large grazing areas required being able to manage and protect those animals. Dogs made this possible in ways that humans alone couldn't achieve. A shepherd with a few good dogs could manage a flock far larger than a shepherd working alone. This allowed pastoral societies to expand, to utilize marginal grasslands that couldn't support farming, to develop economies based on animal husbandry that could be highly successful in the right environments. But the impact of dogs on human society went deeper than just practical services. The relationship with dogs appears to have influenced human emotional and social development in ways that are only beginning to be fully appreciated. Humans who could form bonds with dogs, who could communicate effectively with them, who could interpret their behavior and respond appropriately, had access to the benefits dogs provided. This created selection pressure favoring what we might call interspecies social intelligence, the ability to form relationships and communicate across species boundaries. This capacity isn't trivial or obvious. Most species struggle to communicate effectively with other species, even closely related ones. The fact that humans can form deep emotional bonds with dogs, can interpret their facial expressions and vocalizations, can train them and work with them in complex ways, represents a cognitive capacity that was likely selected for during our coevolution with dogs. Neurological research supports this idea. The same brain regions that activate when we interact with other humans also activate when we interact with dogs. The oxytocin feedback loop that creates bonding between humans and dogs uses neural circuitry that evolved for parent-infant bonding and social bonding among humans. When we interact positively with dogs, we're essentially hijacking emotional and social systems that evolved for within-species relationships and applying them to a different species. This capacity to bond with other species may have had wider implications for human cultural evolution. If humans could form emotional connections with dogs, the conceptual leap to caring for other domesticated animals like sheep, goats, cattle, or horses becomes smaller. The emotional and cognitive toolkit developed through the relationship with dogs may have facilitated later domestications, allowing humans to see other animals not just as resources but as potential partners or at least as beings deserving of care and attention. Dogs also influenced human settlement patterns and social organization. A group with dogs had advantages in defense and hunting that made certain strategies more viable. The presence of dogs might have allowed humans to settle in areas that would otherwise be too dangerous, to maintain smaller group sizes because dogs compensated for reduced human numbers in some tasks, or to organize labor differently because dogs could fill roles that might otherwise require human attention. In many cultures, dogs became deeply embedded in spiritual and mythological systems. They appear in creation stories as companions to deities, as guardians of the afterlife, as symbols of loyalty and devotion. This cultural significance suggests that the relationship with dogs touched something deep in human psychology, something fundamental enough to be encoded in the stories we told ourselves about the nature of the world and our place in it. The ancient Egyptians revered dogs, and the dog-headed god Anubis was associated with mummification and the afterlife. In Greek mythology, Cerberus guarded the entrance to the underworld, and Argos was famous as Odysseus's faithful dog who waited 20 years for his master's return. In Norse mythology, dogs guarded the road to the land of the dead. Across cultures and time periods, dogs appeared in stories and religious contexts as beings with special significance, not just animals but something more. This cultural embedding of dogs in human society had practical effects. Societies that valued dogs, that incorporated them into cultural narratives, that saw them as important members of the community, would invest more in maintaining and improving dog populations. Dogs would be protected, bred selectively for valued traits, incorporated into social structures in ways that strengthened the partnership between species. The coevolutionary relationship also operated at a faster timescale through cultural evolution. Unlike genetic evolution, which requires many generations to produce change, cultural evolution, the transmission of learned behaviors and knowledge from one generation to the next, can occur rapidly. Humans learned how to work with dogs, developing training techniques, breeding strategies, and practices for care and management. This knowledge accumulated and improved over time, passed down through generations and shared among groups. Dogs, for their part, learned from humans and from other dogs. Puppies raised in human households learn from observing humans and older dogs, acquiring behaviors and responses that wouldn't emerge in wolves. This cultural transmission in dogs creates traditions, population-specific behaviors that are learned rather than genetically inherited. Different dog populations can have different behavioral tendencies not because they're genetically different, but because they've learned different things from their environments. The partnership with dogs may have influenced human cognitive evolution in subtle ways. Some researchers have suggested that working with dogs, requiring as it does the ability to communicate across species boundaries, to infer the mental states of another species, to coordinate activities with beings that don't share human language, may have selected for enhanced theory of mind capabilities, the ability to understand that other beings have perspectives, knowledge, and intentions different from our own. This is speculative but intriguing. If humans who could work effectively with dogs had advantages over those who couldn't, and if this ability was partly heritable or at least could be enhanced through developmental experiences, then the presence of dogs in human societies could have exerted subtle selection pressure on human cognition over thousands of years. The physiological effects of the human-dog relationship are increasingly well documented. Interacting with dogs reduces stress hormones like cortisol and increases bonding hormones like oxytocin in humans. People with dogs show lower blood pressure, reduced risk of cardiovascular disease, and better mental health outcomes compared to similar people without dogs. While some of this may be due to the physical activity involved in dog ownership, studies suggest that the emotional and social aspects of the relationship contribute significantly. In modern society, dogs serve roles that likely have ancient roots but have expanded in new directions. Service dogs assist people with disabilities, providing mobility support, medical alert functions, and companionship that enhances quality of life. Therapy dogs work in hospitals, schools, and other settings to provide comfort and emotional support. Search and rescue dogs find missing persons in disaster areas. Detection dogs identify drugs, explosives, diseases, and contraband. The partnership that began with humans and wolves sharing food around Ice Age campfires has evolved into a remarkably diverse relationship spanning countless functions and contexts. Each of these modern roles represents the culmination of thousands of years of coevolution, of both species adapting to each other, learning from each other, changing in response to each other. The human capacity to work with dogs isn't separate from our evolutionary history, it's part of it, woven into our biology and psychology by millennia of partnership. The relationship has shaped both species profoundly. Dogs have changed from wild wolves into beings adapted to live with humans, physiologically, behaviorally, and cognitively different from their ancestors. Humans have changed too, though in more subtle ways, developing capacities for interspecies communication and bonding that may be unique among primates, incorporating dogs into our cultural systems so thoroughly that a world without them would be strange and diminished. This is the essence of coevolution, not one species passively shaped by another, but two species actively influencing each other's trajectory, creating something emergent, a relationship that is more than the sum of its parts, a partnership that has persisted and strengthened over tens of thousands of years. As we lie here in the present moment, surrounded by the comforts of modern life, it's easy to forget that we are the descendants of those Ice Age hunter-gatherers who first formed partnerships with wolves. The world has changed beyond recognition since those frozen landscapes of mammoth and rhinoceros. Cities sprawl across continents. Technology allows us to communicate instantly across the globe. We've walked on the moon and split the atom. Yet in the quiet moments when a dog settles beside us with a contented sigh, we're connected directly to that ancient partnership, maintaining a bond that has survived ice ages and migrations, civilizations rising and falling, technologies transforming human life beyond anything our ancestors could have imagined. The modern dog is a miracle of diversity. From Chihuahuas weighing less than 2 kilograms to Great Danes approaching 90 kilograms, from the flat faces of pugs to the long snouts of greyhounds, from the curly coats of poodles to the hairless skin of Chinese crested dogs. The range of forms encompasses more variation than exists in many entire families of wild animals. This diversity is a testament to the genetic flexibility that domestication created and to human creativity in selecting for traits we found useful or appealing. Today, the International Cynological Federation recognizes more than 300 distinct dog breeds, though many additional breeds are recognized by various national kennel clubs or exist as local varieties not formally recognized. Each breed represents a population bred for specific traits, whether functional like herding or guarding, aesthetic like coat color or ear shape, or behavioral like temperament or trainability. The creation of these breeds accelerated dramatically in the last few centuries, particularly during the Victorian era when dog breeding became a serious hobby among the wealthy and middle classes. Kennel clubs formalized breed standards, specifying exactly what a proper representative of each breed should look like and behave like. Dog shows became popular venues for exhibiting fine specimens and competing for prizes. The genetics underlying inheritance were being discovered during this same period, and enthusiasts quickly applied the new knowledge to breeding programs designed to fix desired traits and eliminate undesired ones. This intensive selective breeding produced remarkable results but also created problems. When breed populations are kept closed, meaning only dogs already registered as members of the breed can be bred to produce more members, genetic diversity inevitably declines. Harmful recessive mutations that might remain rare in a large, diverse population can become common in a small, closed breeding population. Many modern breeds suffer from genetic health problems that result directly from the breeding practices that created them. Some breeds have been bred for physical features that compromise their health. Breeds with extremely short snouts, like bulldogs and pugs, often suffer from breathing difficulties because their shortened skulls haven't provided enough space for proper airways. Breeds with extremely long backs and short legs, like dachshunds, are prone to spinal problems. Giant breeds often have shortened lifespans and increased risk of joint problems and heart disease. These issues have sparked debates about breeding ethics and animal welfare, with some countries implementing regulations to discourage breeding for extreme features that compromise health. Yet despite these concerns, the diversity of modern dogs reflects the many different ways that humans have found dogs useful or appealing. Working dogs still perform essential functions in many contexts. Border collies and other herding breeds help manage livestock on farms and ranches worldwide. Livestock guardian breeds like Great Pyrenees and Anatolian Shepherds protect flocks from predators, just as their ancestors did thousands of years ago. Terriers hunt vermin, retrievers assist hunters, huskies pull sleds in Arctic regions, continuing traditions that in some cases stretch back centuries. Service dogs represent a relatively modern expansion of dog roles that has profoundly impacted many people's lives. Guide dogs for the blind have been used since at least the early 20th century, providing mobility and independence for people with visual impairments. The role has expanded to include hearing dogs for deaf individuals, mobility assistance dogs for people with physical disabilities, medical alert dogs that can detect seizures or dangerous changes in blood sugar levels, and psychiatric service dogs that provide support for people with conditions like post-traumatic stress disorder or severe anxiety. The abilities of some service dogs border on the seemingly miraculous. Dogs have been trained to detect cancer by scent, identifying malignant tumors with accuracy rivaling some medical tests. Dogs can detect impending epileptic seizures minutes before they occur, giving their handlers time to get to safety. Dogs can sense when their diabetic handler's blood sugar is dropping to dangerous levels, alerting them before they become incapacitated. These abilities likely rely on dogs' extraordinary sense of smell and their finely tuned sensitivity to subtle changes in their handler's physiology or behavior, capabilities inherited from their wolf ancestors and refined through domestication and training. The companionship role that dogs fill in modern society would probably be recognizable to our ancient ancestors. Across cultures and throughout history, people have kept dogs not for any practical purpose but simply because they enjoy their company. The emotional bond between humans and dogs, mediated by that ancient oxytocin feedback loop, makes dogs uniquely satisfying companions for many people. Research on the human-dog bond has revealed that it shares characteristics with other significant human relationships. People form genuine attachments to their dogs, experiencing distress when separated and joy at reunion. Dogs serve as sources of emotional support, non-judgmental companions who seem to offer acceptance and affection without the complications that can characterize human relationships. For many people, especially those living alone or facing difficult circumstances, a dog may be their most significant daily social interaction. The health benefits of dog ownership are well documented. People with dogs engage in more physical activity because dogs need walks and exercise. Dog owners have lower blood pressure and better cardiovascular health outcomes on average than non-owners. Interacting with dogs reduces stress hormones and increases feel-good neurotransmitters like dopamine and serotonin. Children raised with dogs may have stronger immune systems and reduced risk of allergies. Elderly people with dogs show better cognitive function and reduced risk of depression. These benefits aren't just correlational, where people who are already healthier choose to get dogs. Experimental studies have shown that interacting with dogs produces measurable physiological changes, lowering heart rate and blood pressure, reducing cortisol levels, and increasing oxytocin. The presence of a dog can make stressful situations more bearable, reducing anxiety and promoting emotional regulation. In modern society, dogs have become so integrated into human life that entire industries have developed to support them. Pet food is a multi-billion-dollar global industry. Veterinary medicine is a sophisticated field employing cutting-edge technology and medical knowledge to keep dogs healthy. Dog training has evolved from simple obedience to understanding canine cognition and applying positive reinforcement methods based on behavioral science. Dog daycare, dog grooming, dog toys, dog clothing, dog furniture. The list of products and services catering to dogs and dog owners seems endless. This economic investment reflects the value that modern humans place on the relationship. In many families, dogs are considered members of the family, not in a metaphorical sense but genuinely, included in family activities, celebrated on birthdays, grieved deeply when they die. The language people use to describe their relationship with dogs has shifted, with many people referring to themselves as their dog's parent rather than owner, reflecting a view of the relationship as one of care and affection rather than property. The cultural presence of dogs in modern society is ubiquitous. Dogs appear in advertising, in movies and television shows, in literature and art. Famous dogs become celebrities, followed by millions on social media. Stories about heroic dogs, loyal dogs, clever dogs circulate widely and touch people emotionally. The cultural motifs established in ancient times, dogs as symbols of loyalty and devotion, persist in modern narratives. The internet has created new venues for celebrating dogs. Videos of puppies playing, dogs performing tricks, or dogs being reunited with their owners after long separations regularly go viral, watched and shared by millions. These videos tap into something fundamental in human psychology, the same emotional response to dogs that our ancestors felt tens of thousands of years ago, now amplified and shared instantaneously across the globe. Scientific research on dogs has exploded in recent decades. Cognitive scientists study how dogs think, how they solve problems, how they interpret human communications. Geneticists continue to unravel the genomic changes that created dogs from wolves. Anthropologists and archaeologists piece together the history of domestication. Behaviorists explore the intricacies of dog behavior and how it can be shaped through training. Veterinarians develop new treatments and preventive care strategies. The modern dog is one of the most intensively studied animals on Earth. This research has revealed that dogs are far more cognitively sophisticated than many people realized. They can understand hundreds of words, learn complex sequences of behaviors, solve problems through insight, show evidence of episodic-like memory for specific events, and demonstrate emotional capacities including jealousy, empathy, and what appears to be a sense of fairness. While their cognitive abilities differ from human abilities in important ways, dogs are clearly intelligent, thinking creatures with rich mental lives. The research has also vindicated what dog owners have long believed, that dogs really do understand us in meaningful ways and form genuine emotional bonds with their human companions. The oxytocin response to mutual gaze, the ability to interpret human pointing and other communicative gestures, the neural activation and reward centers of dog brains when they hear their owner's voice praising them, all provide scientific support for the intuition that our relationships with dogs are real, meaningful, and mutual. Looking to the future, the relationship between humans and dogs will likely continue to evolve. Genetic technologies might allow us to eliminate genetic diseases that plague some breeds, restoring health while maintaining the traits people value. Better understanding of dog cognition and behavior could lead to more effective training methods and better matching of dogs to appropriate homes and roles. Conservation of genetic diversity in dog populations could preserve the full range of capabilities that domestication created. Climate change and other environmental pressures may create new roles for dogs or change how existing roles are performed. As human society continues to change, dogs will adapt alongside us as they have for 40,000 years. The partnership is resilient, built on foundations deep enough to weather tremendous changes while maintaining its essential character. Each modern dog, whether a pampered companion in a city apartment or a working farm dog in a rural area, carries within its genome the legacy of those ancient wolves that first approached human campfires. Each carries behavioral and physical traits shaped by millennia of coevolution. Each participates in a relationship older than civilization, agriculture, writing, or any other human invention except perhaps language itself. When you look into a dog's eyes and see recognition, affection, understanding, you're experiencing something that connects you directly to the deepest reaches of human history. The bond you feel is the same bond felt by an Ice Age hunter sharing meat with a wolf, by a Neolithic farmer working alongside herding dogs, by countless humans across countless generations who found in dogs something irreplaceable. A companion, a helper, a friend, a bridge between human and animal worlds. The story that began in the frozen landscapes of the Pleistocene continues in the present day. Every dog is a living testament to the power of cooperation, to the possibility of communication across species boundaries, to the emotional connections that can form between beings very different from each other. Every dog reminds us that we are not separate from the natural world but part of it, participants in evolutionary processes that continue to unfold, inheritors of relationships that shaped both our species and theirs. As you drift toward sleep tonight, consider that ancient partnership. Consider those first humans and wolves who took the chance on each other, who overcame the barriers of fear and competition to find mutual benefit and eventually something more. Genuine connection, loyalty, love across species lines. Consider the journey from those first tentative encounters to the dog that might be sleeping near you now, the incredible distance traveled, the changes endured, the constants maintained. The relationship between humans and dogs is not perfect. We have sometimes bred them in ways that harm them. We sometimes fail to provide them with what they need. We sometimes forget the depth of the partnership and treat them as mere property rather than companions. But at its best, the relationship represents something beautiful and profound. Two species choosing each other, adapting to each other, building something together that neither could achieve alone. This is the legacy of 40,000 years, written in genes and bones and behavior, preserved in the archaeological record, encoded in our neurochemistry, living on in every interaction between human and dog. It's a legacy worth honoring, worth protecting, worth continuing into whatever future awaits both our species. Rest now. Let your mind settle. The story is told, the journey traced from ancient past to present moment. The wolves became dogs and in doing so helped make us more fully human. The partnership endures, a living connection to our deepest history, a gift from the past to the present and onward into the future. So ends our journey through the long history of the partnership between humans and dogs. From the frozen landscapes of the Ice Age to the modern world, across 40,000 years or more, two species found each other and chose to walk together. What began as practical necessity, sharing resources in a harsh environment, became something far more profound. A bond that transcends species, a relationship built on mutual understanding, trust, and affection. As you settle deeper into rest, carry with you the knowledge that this partnership continues, that every dog today participates in an unbroken chain reaching back to those first wolves who dared to approach human campfires. The bond you feel with a dog, whether your own or one you've met, is real, grounded in biology and history, shaped by tens of thousands of years of coevolution. Sleep well, knowing that the story of humans and dogs is one of the most beautiful chapters in the book of life on Earth. A story of cooperation triumphing over competition, of communication bridging different worlds, of loyalty and love enduring across the ages. If you've enjoyed this journey through time, please consider subscribing to this channel and leaving a like on this video. Your support helps us create more deep dives into fascinating historical topics, more stories that connect us to our past and help us understand the world we live in today. Sweet dreams. May you rest as peacefully as a dog by the fire, surrounded by warmth and safety, connected across the ages to the ancient partnership that helped make us human. Good night.